Welcome to the first episode of Deep in Opponent's Territory. I'm Matt Johnson, and this is the newest weekly YouTube video in which I'll be discussing everything related to the Green Bay Packers. Both reviewing what happened last week, previewing what's going to happen this next week, and going over anything in between, such as fantasy, even doing a little bit of Madden Packers talk. And also I want this to be a discussion both between myself and other Packers fans out there who don't have the blessing of living in Wisconsin. Now I call this Deep in Opponent's Territory because obviously I am a huge cheesehead, and I currently find myself living in the heart of Chicago, roughly 10 minutes away from Soldier Field. So I've decided to start this YouTube video to just connect with other Packers fans, maybe even some other Packers fans in the Chicago area. There are a lot, actually, I've come to find since moving up here. So I'm not going to mess around too much and beat around the bush. I'm going to get right into it with what this video series is about, which is just my analysis of how the Packers are doing on a week-to-week basis. So obviously this is a great week to start, coming off a 42-24 huge win on the road at the Houston Texans. Obviously Aaron Rodgers lit it up. I'm sure we all have seen now the 6 touchdowns, 338 yards, no interceptions. Jordy Nelson, of course, being on the receiving end of half of those touchdowns, and he had over 100 yards receiving. James Jones also came up big. He had 2 touchdowns, and Tom Crabtree had the other. So what does this mean, other than the fact that the Houston Texans are no longer undefeated and the Packers got a much-needed win? Well, going into this week, there was a lot of discussion made about how the Packers' offense hadn't been clicking, on how it didn't have the explosiveness that it had last year. And I'm sure all us Packers fans have just gotten tired of watching what last year was the number 1 offense in the league just completely look like it had been replaced. I don't like using that word anymore, but the biggest thing about this is we saw those big plays. Houston made a couple of mistakes, and the Packers were able to capitalize on it. Especially in the first quarter, you saw Houston had a penalty on 4th down, and then Rodgers came out on the very next play and fired a 41-yard touchdown pass to Nelson. They also had, in the second quarter, a 21-yard touchdown pass from Rodgers to Nelson. And then there was the 48-yard touchdown pass to Tom Crabtree. So obviously the big play was really clicking in this game, and it was really obvious and evident that this was the offense that we've been waiting to see. However, that being said, before everyone in Packer Nation gets so excited about the offense is back and the defense held this really good Houston team to 21 points, especially considering, or 24 points, sorry, considering a lot of it was in garbage time. There was the blocked punt, Arian Foster's touchdown run after Green Bay had really started to gain momentum and take control of the game. You know, they really squashed the Houston Texans, both offensively and defensively in this game. But a lot of people in the national media were making a big deal after one game that, oh no, and I know this is what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to hit the panic button and make you think that one game means Green Bay has lost all their explosiveness. Well, then they didn't have that explosiveness for a couple more games, and the same goes true now. Just because we've had this huge game against a really good team doesn't mean the offense is completely fixed. They really need to keep this up. So, who's coming up next? Well, we got the St. Louis Rams, and this is what I mean by we got to keep this up. The Rams are 5th in passing defense, 14th in rushing defense. The NFC West just decided that their defense was all going to beast this year, and I don't know why or how, but even the St. Louis Rams are getting in on the act. So yeah, it was great. We got this big win in Houston. Now we continue to go on the road into the Edward Jones Dome, or as I like to call it, the Lambeau Dome. I've been to a couple of Packers games in St. Louis at the Edward Jones Dome, and there was plenty of green and gold to go around. So this is still going to be a huge test on this Packers offense. And this week is just as important as last when it comes to, is the Packers offense back? Has Aaron Rodgers fixed these tweaks? That he said, he hasn't been playing up to in his radio show, he said he hasn't been playing to the best of his ability. So have these problems been fixed? Well, here comes a top 5 passing defense in the National Football League, and we're going into their house to play them. So it looks like this is going to be a pretty good test of that. Now, I mentioned that Aaron Rodgers had problems that even he admitted that he wanted to fix. So what are some of these problems that have been plaguing this Packers offense, and what did they do better in Houston that allowed them to put up this outrageous passing performance? And I think a lot of it has to do with the pass protection. I know I, for one, as well as a lot of people, were really excited when Jeff Saturday came on board. Obviously, he's been a great center in Indianapolis. But as good as a player as he is, anytime you introduce a new offensive lineman, especially a center, which is the cornerstone of the offensive line, anytime you introduce them into a new pass blocking scheme, especially when that pass blocking is so important for a team like the Packers, it's going to take a little bit of time for them to, melt into that scheme. And I think now you're starting to see Jeff Saturday really start to pick up on the nuances of the Packers' offensive line and what they want to do to protect Aaron Rodgers. And now I think it's starting to show. So I think over these next couple weeks, I am very optimistic. I think everything is going to get better. I think the pass protection is going to stay there, and I think Aaron Rodgers is going to see more big plays open up. Obviously, Greg Jennings has been out, but once he gets back, it'll just even further along this progression of the Packers offense. Another thing that's been talked about, at least, is the so-called lack of the run game. It was and another way that they could take some of that pass rush off of Aaron Rodgers is to run the ball. And you saw this in the second half of that Seattle game, which I'm not going to talk too much more about, other than the fact that once they started handing the ball off to Cedric Benson, Seattle couldn't just send everyone ears back straight at Aaron Rodgers. They had to protect against the run. When Cedric Benson got hurt, I was really afraid that they wouldn't be able to do this, but I'm also really hopeful in Alex Green. I think he's actually going to be able to get the job done. He was able to somewhat get the job done in Houston. Yeah, he only had 65 rushing yards on 22 attempts, but he did have a couple of, 5-10-yard runs that made the Houston defense respect him, and I think Alex Green is going to do fine in the Packers' offensive system. He's coming out of Hawaii back when June Jones was the coach. He played and learned in a run-and-shoot offense. So I think he'll mix in just fine with what the Packers do with the spread and with the hurry-up that they try to run. So I think this is actually going to be a really good fit, and even though the Cedric Benson signing was so big and he's going to be out for a while, I think the Packers are going to be okay, especially now that they got their pass blocking down, and I think Alex Green will do fine as a serviceable back. So, moving on, next I'm going to talk a little fantasy football for any of those who have the Packers on their fantasy football teams. ESPN has Aaron Rodgers and Drew Brees ranked 1A and 1B as far as quarterbacks go. Obviously, as far as running backs, Alex Green, nobody really knows what's going to happen. He only accounted for 6 fantasy points last week. 65 rushing yards. Didn't really do too much in the ground game. ESPN has him ranked 23rd overall as far as halfbacks, which is actually really good. because the guy they got at number 24 is Sean Green, who had a huge week. As far as wide receivers go, the Packers have 3 receivers in the top 30 of ESPN's fantasy rankings. Obviously, Jordy Nelson, James Jones, and Randall Cobb. So this looks like it could actually be, as far as fantasy goes, a pretty decent week for the Green Bay Packers. I know I will be starting Aaron Rodgers, as I do every week. So in sticking with the fantasy aspect of it, I want to look at Madden roster updates. The Madden roster updates are out today, so let's see what they've given the Green Bay Packers. Obviously, it's been a pretty good week all around. Eric Walden, James Starks, and Jermichael Finley were the only 3 Packers to see decreases this week. Aaron Walden dropped to a 71, James Starks to a 72, and Jermichael Finley to an 84. And then everywhere else, you saw some increase and some considerable increase. Tom Crabtree increased up to a 68. Evan Dietrich Smith is also a 68 now. That's a 1-point bump for him. Jarrell Worthy is now a 70 overall. M.D. Jennings has continued his climb up the Madden rankings. He's now a 70 overall as well. And so is Alex Green after, like I said, he had a couple of big plays in Houston, a couple 5-10-yard runs, made them respect his running game, and so he gets bumped up to 70. Casey Hayward came up with a couple picks over the week, got bumped up to 72. Randall Cobb has now crossed the threshold. He is an 80 overall. James Jones got bumped up to an 83 after making a couple of great catches. A.J. Hawk and the continued work he's done around the middle has bumped him up to an 85 overall. Ryan Bulaga is now an 88. And Jordy Nelson, talk about threshold crossing, has now, at least on Madden, become one of the top receivers in the game. He's been bumped up from an 89 to a 92 overall. Cedric Benson has been placed on the IR, so is DJ Smith, Brandon Sane. Greg Jennings has been dropped on the depth chart, but only due to injury. And then Eric Walden has been moved to the second outer linebacker position. Brad Jones has been moved up to the first middle linebacker position, and Jordy Nelson has been moved to the number 1 wideout spot on the depth chart, as well as the Packers signing of halfback Johnny White. The Houston Texans saw a couple of decreases this week in their secondary. Glover Quinn, as well as Jonathan Joseph, both had 1-point decreases after Aaron Rodgers lit them up. So that's what I've got for this week. I want to hear some feedback, maybe what you want to see me do in the show. This is obviously the first episode, so I'd really love to see this kind of grow and expand and see what else we could get. So thank you for watching, and go Pack, go.